All right, well, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Kyle Lewis, the VP of Cybersecurity and Strategy for RDCT, one of the InCommon catalysts. I'm going to wait till Drew's done. There we go. All right. Kyle comes to us from the U.S. Air Force, where he was an authorizing official for many, many years. He worked for the Air Force for 21 years. He is also instrumental and essentially the founding parental unit for the Certify tabletop exercise that we've been doing every year for 4 years. 4 years. An incredibly important test of federated incident response. So one of the things that, in fact, National Institutes of Health funded it for the first 3 years, and InCommon and NIH are splitting the cost for it this year. Incredibly important for the community to test out how we respond to these types of incidents. So it's been some great learnings. He also was one of the key authors of the mapping document that we have out on the InCommon site that maps the NIST IL2 to REFEDS IP high. And that something similar to that mapping document was used internally for NIH to accept the risk for the use of the REFEDS standards and InCommon in lieu of the NIST ones. So clearly the guy knows a bit and has a lot to say. So without further ado, Kyle, please.
Hello, everyone. I feel like today is the end of a journey and maybe the start of another one. This QR code will take you straight to the implementation guide that I'm going to talk about. And don't worry if you don't get it now. The very last slide is going to have 3 QR codes to the different documents that I've referenced throughout this presentation. I see phones on the move, cameras on the move. I'll pause. Okay. But the theme of today is, let's start doing it now, but do the easy stuff first. Well, why are we here? I think most everyone in this room understands the importance of identity proofing, understands the importance of protecting sensitive data, the dimension of confidentiality. But what this boils down to is when you issue a network credential or create an account for someone in layman's terms and give that account to someone, how sure are you that person is who they claim to be? And from the government perspective, which is where I spend most of my time, was working for the government on system accreditation. That's how I got into this topic. Research data, which is a lot of what we deal with, defaults to something called the moderate security level, or FISMA moderate level system. So FISMA has 3 security levels of low, medium, and high. A lot of stuff defaults to moderate, which includes research data. And that comes with certain requirements. And so how did I get my systems accredited to NIST standards in this community that's not a government community and then the international community at large? So there I was, a new employee of RDCT trying to make this happen. And my boss, Chris, said, you need to go to this meeting. And I was like, oh, okay, what is the meeting is this? And I jumped into the meeting, and there's people from Sweden and people from the UK, and then a nice German lady running things. And it was the REFEDS Assurance Framework Working Group version 1.0 with the close of all that. And they were having this conversation of, what do I do? Or not what do I do, but what do we do next? And I'm going, I have to map this to NIST to convince my boss, the authorizing official, to accept the risk. And in order to do that, I need to articulate to him, what is the risk I'm asking you to accept? And so that began a journey. And as you may have heard earlier today at the NIH presentation, they announced, said it publicly before, but publicly here in this forum, that REFEDS Assurance Framework IP High is now accepted as comparable to the NIST Identity Assurance Level 2. So that was thank you. That's how I felt when Ashraf said that. I got like these weird goosebumps, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm having a moment. The credits are rolling, the soundtrack theme is rolling, and then at the very end, there's a stinger that says, to be continued. It's like, okay. So it's time. We are here now. As I talked about this journey a little bit already, but it started in 2021, and there were multiple dragons to slay along the way of this quest. So a number of people in this room were involved with me. I got thrown into it. We updated the REFEDS Assurance Framework to version 2.0. That's actually what we're here to talk about today. And then the following year, most of you probably know a esteemed gentleman by the name of Tom Barton. He and I co-wrote a paper together based on the new framework, targeting as an audience government authorizing officials, saying, hey, here is the new version of REFEDS, or of RAF, and what is this risk that we're asking you to accept, and where might you want to consider some compensating controls to accept that? Well, that work ended up feeding the NIH team and helping them champion that. And then so the following year, so we were like, okay, well, we just talked to the service providers, but what about the identity providers? Because the service providers have to accept the risk, but the identity providers have to do the work. And so REFEDS is written from an international perspective, but everyone in InCommon lives in a US reality. So the way we tend to solve these problems might be a little different from the way Sweden tends to solve these problems. So we decided to develop an implementation guide, and it was me, Tom Barton, John Miner, and Kevin Hickey from UC Mercy, I think, as the primary authors on this. And that took about another year. And that came out this past summer. And then at the same time, as you heard, the Controlled Access Data Repositories, or the CADRs that NIH operates or funds, is now going to require IL2. You have three choices. You can either tell your users to go to login.gov and get an account. They can go to id.me and get an account. Or if you do RAF High and signal that, they'll be able to continue to enjoy using your credentials. So now it's time to do the thing. And this presentation is probably the first that I've given where we're actually going to look at the spec and walk through every claim and talk about what it means. So I apologize in advance. This is after lunch. If you happen to fall asleep, there is no shame. This is recorded, and you can come back and watch it. But the guide itself, and you had the QR code to it from the beginning, and you'll see it again. This is not technical implementation. We are not going to tell you how to configure your shibboleth stack or your Windows solution or anything like that. That's still up to you to figure out. We are not going to tell you how to record the claims and track all that. A lot of the feedback I've gotten in discussions of REFEDS Assurance Framework over these TechX years from various people saying, this is impossible, we can't do this, we can't make these claims. There's a lot of concern about how do we even know we qualify to make these claims. So the blocker there is more mental and less technology. It's, do my business processes reflect the reality? Will my legal team let me make this claim about my university? And so this implementation guide is really here to help you figure out what are those claims you can already make. And then if you have a need for more, build the roadmap to achieve that. So key areas that we hit in the front of the document is if you're in InCommon, you're part of the way there already. And I'll talk about that. But you already qualify for some claims. If you don't, you have other concerns about not meeting baseline expectations, and then we'll let you sort that out. The other thing is REFEDS Assurance Framework covers a lot of ground. You don't have to do all of it, ever. I would recommend thinking of it as a language and use it to describe what you already do today with the minimal amount of work and change possible. Not all of the claims need to be made for every user. And I would argue that not all of your users need any claims at all. Only those users who actually reach out into the Federation, which for some institutions is not everyone. Some institutions, it's a small percentage of the population. So consider those scoping mechanisms to try to diminish this scary elephant we're asking you to eat and focus on like what bite at the time. Some of your users already qualify for the claims, some of these claims, I guarantee you. Not a single one of you has 0 users qualifying for claims. For example, every single US employee will qualify for IAP low, period dot, because they had to get hired and go through an I-9 process. So you know they're an actual person. And you probably have more existing business processes that can be leveraged. The guide has two approaches. It talks to you about a phased approach. I already alluded to that. Think of it as a language first. We're not going to implement anything new. We're going to describe what we already have. That's the first phase. The guide is also not normative text. It's informative. It's explaining the REFEDS Assurance Framework from a US perspective. It assumes you have already read the spec or are reading it side by side. It is not intended to educate you completely on the spec. It will refer to things and expect you to know what it's talking about. And to highlight again, some of your users already qualify for these claims, and almost certainly you have processes outside of your IAM team or your IT team that you can leverage. Okay, these are the 5 steps, the phases. We broke them into 2 main areas: describe and implement. The spec has a number of identity assurance claims, and that's what most people think about when they think about the REFEDS Assurance Framework. It has some claims that aren't about identity assurance as well. We actually suggested starting with those first. Those are going to be easier questions for you to answer. And then when you go through that and describe what you already have, then you go figure out what local enterprise is. And we'll get into the details on that. And then you can go and look at what does it mean to be IAP low, medium, or high. And for those of you who have users wanting to access the NIH categories, it will be IAP high. Once you do all that and describe what you already have, the implement phase becomes a little easier. You've already done the discovery work. You already understand what the spec means by that point. Then you just need to determine if any other users need to be stepped up. What does implementing that process look like? What does finding the right technology tool and architecture to facilitate that look like? And then if you make any change, institution-wide, then you adjust any account issuance procedures for any new users, which are where appropriate. But we really want you to start on the first part. So we'll get into the non-IAP claims. So step 1, conformance criteria. These claims are expressed as values of the EduPerson assurance in the refeds.org assurance namespace. And when you put in assurance, that just means it's what they call the conformance criteria. The minimum claim you need to make to use the spec is the assurance claim, and to qualify for that, you have to meet InCommon baseline expectations. It's not because REFEDS is written by InCommon, but it's because somewhere along the lines, and I don't know if it started in InCommon and got plagiarized by REFEDS, or it started at REFEDS but got plagiarized by InCommon, but the text is the same. So if you're in InCommon, you can make the assurance claim, and then for this version 2, make the claim version 2. You can all do that today with no additional work. Now we have, in my mind, they're the oddball claims, but they're the ones that I'm not used to working with as much because I'm more focused on identity assurance, but they have this claim called ID unique. And if you assert that, it means 4 things. One of those identifiers on the screens are provided at your login assertion. If you're not providing one of those, then ID unique is not a claim you can make. But it also means, okay, so you're using one of those. It represents a single person and will never be reassigned, and you have a means to contact that person. So if all 4 of those criteria are true, you can claim ID unique for that user. And then there are 2 EPPN variant claims. So EPPN has been widely used over the years, and apparently over the history of its life cycle and over the evolution of its specification in practice, some of the EPPNs have been reassigned. So these 2 claims may be asserted for EPPNs in a case where they're never reassigned in your institution, or the case where they might have been reassigned, but not less than a year since the previous person left the organization. So I think this almost wraps up the non-IEP claims. Oh no, and then we have attribute quality and professionalism. This is still a non-IEP claim. The idea here is if a person changes affiliation and leaves your organization for whatever reason, how long is it before your official system of record reflects that change? They find a new job, they leave, they graduate as a student, whatever it is. And so there's a claim of freshness of 1 day or 1 month. These claims solely pertain to eduperson affiliation, scoped affiliation, or eduperson primary affiliation. And they only attain to the following values: faculty, student, staff, employee, or member. The REFEDS Assurance Frameworks consider these to be true while it is shown in the corresponding system of record, whatever that is for your university, like your HR system or your student system. Whether you as an IAM team, the credential service provider, the IDP operator, whether you accurately reflect that value within 1 day or within 31 days determines which of these claims you can make. And if the CSP takes longer than 31 days, then you cannot make those claims. So we're still in a described process. Okay, now we're going to start moving into identity assurance itself. And we're going to look at local enterprise. The identity assurance profiles in the REFEDS Assurance Framework are broken into 2 big categories. Local enterprise is risk-based, and the ones we typically think about, low, medium, and high, are process-based. And we'll talk about those, but right now we're going to focus on local enterprise because we're doing the easy stuff first. Local enterprise, the way Tom Barton explained it to me, originally came about from a concept of we're all research and education universities or institutions. We all have similar aims and desires and a sphere of concern. Local enterprise is a way to say, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me, because we share the same risk profile. If you're willing to assume the identity risk for this user, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to be willing to assume that same risk. What the spec technically says is you have people on your team and in your institution that access your most critical systems. They could be HR systems, they could be financial systems, they could be grades, anything that you need to have assurance of with that person. We don't know how you vetted the people you grant that access to, but we trust that you understand your critical systems. And any user that goes through a similar or better process, whether they access those systems or not, it could be a student, qualifies for local enterprise. These are examples of critical systems. Your institution will need to determine if these are your critical systems. So our assertion is every member, every institution has local enterprise qualified people by definition, because you all have critical systems. So we assert that you should make these claims for all these users. Find out who those accounts, those users are at the critical level, give them local enterprise, and then make a determination, talk to your HR people, talk to your registrar, and say, hey, who else follows the same level of onboarding, and give them local enterprise. There may not be a formal identity proofing process because this is not a claim about process. So the spec is actually silent on how formal or informal this decision is made. Now we're going to move on to, I guess, what most people tend to think about, low, medium, or high. It's a little easier to wrap a decision maker's mind around the graded level. So At this point in your describe process, you will have gone through the non-IEP claims, you will figure out who your local enterprise users are, and now you're going to start maybe having to spend some time talking to your onboarding folks, your HR folks, your registrar, understand how people come in before they hit the IT world, or if they hit you too soon, how, where does that proofing happen? So as far as terms go, claimant in this case means any person seeking an account, and we have referred to the registrar as any person or system performing the proofing. So as you do your discovery, use the IEP levels to, again, describe what you're already doing. So there are general requirements between all the levels, no matter whether you're IEP, low, medium, or high. Some of them apply to records keeping. And this is actually the area that we talk about the least and might be your biggest barrier to entry on some of this stuff. First of all, your process needs to ensure it's the same person throughout the process. That's pretty self-explanatory, but it needs to be stated. Second of all, whether you're low, medium, or high, you need to have your process documented in some way, shape, or form. And the implication is the people doing the proofing are trained on that process. It might be simple, but it needs to be written down. And then for all levels, you need to keep records on when a person was proofed and at the level to which they were proofed. And you would have to keep that anyway, because you have to know what you're signaling, so you have to write that down, so to speak. And then you document any changes in binding between the person and any associated authenticators. Medium adds the requirement. You need to record the attributes that were used, that were validated in the proofing. So for example, if you're using a Real ID driver's license, you need to record that you used a Real ID driver's license. IP high adds, you need to record what their driver's license number was. You do not take a picture or make a copy of the driver's license itself. I mean, you could, but that's not required by this spec. So I suspect in your discovery, this is probably going to be the side effect that you have to chase down. Then we have requirements for authenticator bindings. So if someone resets a password or changes an authenticator, it has to maintain the proofed identity. We recommend backup authenticators being bound to your account. So if someone comes to your help desk to say, hey, I lost my password, but they have a backup authenticator, they can authenticate with that. It preserves the assurance level. You issue them a new password, they go on their way, or token, or whatever it is. But if that binding is lost, they have to be reproofed at the same or a higher level. Otherwise, their claim must be downgraded. This does become an IAM or an IT problem to manage. So now let's get into the differences, the other differences, which usually focuses on the evidence and validating and verifying the evidence. IP low is very simple. I would think of Netflix, in addition to Netflix Plus, because Netflix doesn't really care about recording your driver's license. It would be similar. Your contact information, you need to get contact information for your users. But they don't care who you are, but they do care you're a real person. The Netflix example is they care that you're able to pay them. Medium, I like to think of as, I'd like to go drink a beer, but a little bit more than that. But it's, someone's going to physically look at a piece of identity evidence, and in the US that's usually an ID card or driver's license, something like that. And if it looks reasonably legitimate, then that will qualify for the IEP medium claims. Now, bear in mind, you still have to meet the records documentation process for account issuance that I already addressed. So it's a little bit more than going up to the bar, because the bar's not going to write down that they looked at your driver's license. But as far as the evidence practice, that's pretty much it. And then high is the license is validated and verified against an externally authoritative source in the context of you, the identity provider. So IEP high tends to be easier in person. What gets a lot of angst is how do you scale it out and do it remotely? Details of low. Low is simple. It's an assertion of your personhood. If you have employees, they all qualify for low. If you have not used E-Verify and you're using just a simple I-9 process, you can pass an I-9 process without a photo ID, which means you could only qualify for low, but all employees qualify for at least IAP low. You can also see official transcripts obtained directly from schools for students coming in would also suffice for IAP low for students who are not employees, right? Normally. Then you have this idea of remote proofing. Remote proofing doesn't really add a lot of specific requirements. There are a few. But remote proofing means you have to take the in-person requirements and figure out how you're going to account for the fact that you're not in person with each other. So for remote proofing, you need to figure out a way to prove they're a person. And I know this is a horrible example now. You know, the normal I'm not a robot thing is what tends to apply at this level, although we're going into new waters, and I don't know that kit couldn't be an automated, you know what I mean? But that's the example. So for IAP medium, we talk about a person with a reasonably validated and verified identity. So in person, an unexpired government photo ID is the standard case. And the person checking the ID, it has to look valid to them, and they will look at the photo and it reasonably matches. If you pass the I-9 process with a government-issued photo ID, you qualify for medium. Here's the kicker. In a pure I-9 world, you cannot legally, HR cannot legally require a photo ID to pass the I-9 process. There are valid identifications, because they're not worried, that the I-9 process is not concerned about identity. It's concerned about citizenship and the right to be able to work. And are they hireable as a US citizen, a person, or someone who's here in an approved manner. That being said, if your HR process happens to do the I-9 process and happens to have documented what evidences were used, anyone who used a photo ID qualifies for medium. You should leverage your school campus ID. So if someone comes to your help desk with a school campus ID and they have that school campus ID would have qualified for medium, then there's a transitive property that goes on there and they can qualify for medium on their account. So for remote supervised proofing, and when we talk about supervised and unsupervised proofing, it's really supervised remote is synchronous, it's still live. The registrar is there with the claimant, but removed. The unsupervised proofing is the automated case where the claimant will go through the process and then the registrar might look at the evidences and the stuff after the fact. Remote, the live proofing, the requirements are the same as in person. You just have to figure out how do you meet the evidence requirements. And there are tools out there that you can buy that do that. A lot of this has probably been solved for you in the COVID era. Remote unsupervised proving, same thing, you have to figure out how to use an authoritative external source. But what happens here on the spec is a requirement that was for high in person is now added to medium remote unsupervised. I already talked about a little bit the authenticator recovery. If they've not bound an additional authenticator or a backup authenticator of some sort to get a new password reset or whatever, they must be reproofed at IAP medium in that process, or you can no longer assert it. Okay, now we're moving into high. Well-validated and verified identity. What does that mean? Well, the spec has requirements, of course. We have an unexpired government photo ID, just like we did in medium, and it's validated against a legitimate and verified. It's validated as legitimate and verified against an authoritative source. if there is an electronic verification component, that has to be cryptographically protected. Oftentimes, you're going to have to procure a third-party solution for this if you're doing a step-up implementation, especially if you get into a remote automated kind of thing. The Kantara Initiative Trust Status List, I have another slide with a link to that, has a list of services that will meet more than RAF High, but the NIST IL2 requirement. From an I-9 and employer perspective, if you are using E-Verify and if the employer checks the physical or electronic security features of the photo ID, that hiring process gets you to IAP High. Same thing with e-passport. And so when it says the employer must also check the physical or electronic security features, what that means is the employer will validate the photo ID's physical and or electronic security features if the ID has such features. Okay. And then we get into supervised remote and unsupervised remote proofing. This becomes more challenging. How do you check for the physical security features of holograms and watermarks? You might have to get specific tools designed for that purpose. And for unsupervised, okay, there it is, right at the bottom, kantarainitiative.org/trust status list. We are not necessarily endorsing these, but Kantara is endorsing these, so that is a possible solution for you. But in most cases, you might have to leverage a third-party tool. So this slide, some of you will have seen. We used a slide like this to help the authorizing officials understand where RAF IAP High sat in regards to IAL2, but this matrix can be used the other way too. And the RAF spec itself and our implementation guide tells all of you, if you are already using one of these Kantara solutions that's NIST certified, or if you are already doing something at the NIST level, or if you're in Europe and you're already doing IDAS substantial, you don't need to read the RAF spec and figure out if you're doing what IAP. You are IAP High, you can make that claim and go on your merry way. And I've already talked about some of the ways that your I-9 and E-Verify process, once you understand what your HR team is recording as far as E-Verify, you also might already qualify for some of these claims without having to spend a lot of time finding a new solution. Okay. We're moving into the implement phase, which is very short, because I have nothing new to add to this, because we've walked through the entire spec of the REFEDS Assurance Framework. But you might want to consider, we have a case at one of our international labs where we had to figure out what we are going to broadcast to the Federation. And we determined, talking through the HR process between our IT team and the HR team, when researchers were onboarded and hired before a certain date, they could only qualify for medium. But after a certain date, based on know your banking laws and extra checks that had been changed in the HR process, they could qualify for high. So we did the described process by account and painted everyone with high who qualified, but everyone who had come in a long time ago were medium, and then implemented a step-up process. If they came into a situation where they needed to access a federated resource that required high, they could come to the help desk, and we could step them up, is what it boils down to. What we would also say is, once you've gone through your described process, only do the work to upgrade to new claims if you have a business need. Now, I would offer if you operate a CADR, there might be a compelling business need now. But again, this gets back to you need not do the entire spec for all your campus. Think about step-up identity proofing. So if your HR process doesn't get you to where you need to go, what gaps do you need to close at the help desk or in your institution to allow that to the people who do need it? And then consider third-party proofing services. So you don't have to do it all at once. You are already meeting some requirements. Consider step-up processes. And focus on trust, compliance, and leveraging existing practices. And here are your 3 document QR codes. We have the IDP implementation guide that I just walked through. We have the RAF 2.0 spec itself, so that's probably important to have as well. And then for those of you who operate service providers, even if you don't operate a government service provider, this probably would be interesting to you to see what those gaps are between the REFEDS Assurance Framework spec and the NIST IL2 older spec Rev 3, which is when we did the analysis. The high to IL2 gap in the new Rev 4 that just came out is not substantially different. This concludes the presentation now. I'll open the floor to any questions or conversation.
Notice that you're pretty sensitive to the validity of the government documents, for example, the validity period of the passport, as an example. What about when that government issued credential does expire? Does the assertion also expire? Are they tied to each other? And maybe speak to just the durability of the assertion level.
Right here, in case you haven't noticed. So I think that's a really good question. So I'm going to answer that by saying the statement of a RAF claim of low, medium, or high, statement of identity proofing, is a statement of a one-time event. Now, your process, you did the process, you proofed them. It's a statement of how sure you were of that person's identity at the time of account creation and issuance. So if the government identity card expires, your assurance does not expire. Your identity assurance claim. But this is where NIST is a little bit more explicit on this. And in the REFEDS Assurance Framework, authentication assurance, MFA, is out of scope of that framework, but we do talk about it. If you want to preserve the assurance of the person using the account, that was the same person that was proofed, you have to consider things like multi-factor authentication and other things that are outside of spec. If they come back to you, they've not done their extra binding of the other credential, or you don't have a backup code or something like that, they lost their password, their token, and you have to proof them again, and then it's expired, then that's not, you can't maintain the assurance. Does that make sense?
I have a question. Is the only time that you reproof someone the case you just mentioned? Or is there a practice around identity proofing for certain types of individuals after a certain time period?
Within the context of the REFEDS Assurance Framework, and I'm going to now pitch this question to my team if I'm speaking wrong, I'm having a hard time imagining another case that would require that sort of thing. That being said, outside of that context, those of us in certain positions have to undergo periodic background investigation checks, so that kind of happens depending on the sensitivity of the information. But I think RAF High is the NIST middle level, or the European middle level. You lose an authenticator, you lose that preservation of insurance, or the account gets compromised. But that's still that same kind of case, I would think.
The case where you're checking your background, the fact that they're validating your identity is a byproduct of making sure that you aren't now a different sort of security risk.
One of the things I really liked is that you repeatedly pointed out that the business processes in many cases are already being done, right? And it's just almost a mechanical step at this point to assert the thing when everything has been already done to get to that level of proofing. I wonder, I see parallels to the notion that oftentimes institutions have a ID card issuance system that is somewhat a whole separate identity practice, and oftentimes isn't the same team at all than the digital identity folks. I wonder whether we have an opportunity in this community to try and close that real or perceived gap and get a bit closer to having a unified process that bridges between the business process and the resulting artifacts, both digital and in the old days they used to be physical, but now of course those are digital credentials also.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, thank you very much for your time.